Welcome to this edition of the Committee on the Present Danger China's webinar series focused on the unrestricted warfare the Chinese Communist Party has been waging against the United States of America for decades. This particular program will feature principally a front in that unrestricted warfare that has largely been unacknowledged until now. And the now is the statement the President of the United States made last night, as we speak, to the American people, in which he very explicitly spoke of intelligence information and other documentation that he has made available to the American people, making clear that, in fact, the Chinese Communist Party has been engaged in what I would think of as unrestricted electoral warfare against our country. We are, in the course of this program, going to tease out what we've learned about that operation on the Chinese Communist Party's part. We're going to talk about the implications of a nation that is the mortal enemy of the United States, effectively pursuing regime change in our country, and doing so successfully. Not alone. It had company, particularly in the 2020 election. We are going to talk about the extent to which various other factors besides the Chinese and their allies, like notably Venezuela, were involved in taking steps to perpetrate fraud against the American people and in the process disenfranchise American voters who had the right to vote and did vote, only to find that their votes were either not counted or were more than offset by votes that were improperly cast and unlawfully counted. To kick this all off, I'm very pleased to say we have with us the chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China, Brian T. Kennedy. If you have been watching the news media over the past 24 hours or so, you have seen him prominently commenting on the run-up to the president's speech, then in its aftermath, what he said and its importance. And we are very proud to be able to present him for similar purpose at this juncture. Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, over to you.
Well, thank you, Frank. Great to be with you, and very proud to be with the team we have assembled here this morning. This is really an A-team of national security experts, and I'm very proud to work with you, Frank, and with them on these important issues, most especially the threat from communist China. I will say I thought the president's speech was great last night. It was the beginning of an important examination that this country is going to have to take into our election system. The president said the elections were not secure. Now, we know most of the time he says the 2020 election was stolen. I and many others believe it was stolen. Last night, he was really laying out the evidence, such as we have today, on how it was stolen. He was careful, I thought, in his words, but he was absolutely clear that communist China was involved, that they engaged in political warfare against us, that they sought to remove him from office, he said, and to make sure that his presidency would fail and that he couldn't get reelected. How they did that was a variety of means. They penetrated voter databases. They were engaged in an active information warfare campaign against the United States and President Trump. And he wanted the world to know that. And he wanted the American people to understand that because of their capabilities, something's going to have to be done. Among those capabilities would certainly be their cyber capabilities. He didn't mention this, but certainly everyone knows they have the most sophisticated, or among the most sophisticated, cyber warfare armies in the world. They have between, it's believed, 600,000 to 1 million men in that cyber army. They have some of the most advanced AI in the world. And so their ability to penetrate our voter systems, which the president said are vulnerable, is simply, having that kind of a system, he said, quote, was simply not defensible. And so I thought that was laying down last night an important marker that given communist China and their capabilities, that having an electronic voting system was not defensible. He talked about mail-in ballots and their vulnerabilities. What he didn't say, and what most of the commentators did not address, let me say, we can believe that the system that we currently have with electronic voting and with mail-in balloting, the combination of those two things are really designed for fraud in serious people's opinions. It's just from a common sense point of view, the idea that an electronic voting machine wouldn't be vulnerable is simply unrealistic. The same would be true of mail-in ballots. With mail-in ballots, you can obviously engage in all sorts of, duplication of ballots, mailing in other people's ballots, what have you. But the key point, I think, last night that people weren't drawing was if they tapped into our voter databases and had access to, the president used, I think, 200 or 220 million voter rolls or voter, files. That's everybody who votes in America. If they have access to those, what communist China could then do would be to find within those voter rolls all the low propensity voters in the country. That could be itself probably, 40 or 50 million people who are what we call low propensity voters. All they have to do is take a percentage of the low propensity voters and, take those names, produce counterfeit ballots, because we know the ballots that that people vote on, or there's nothing secure about the ballots themselves. Communist China, if we just want to play it out, could steal the names, which they did. We know they could, in theory, counterfeit ballots. Counterfeiting a ballot would be much easier than counterfeiting, for instance, a $100 bill or a $20 bill. You counterfeit the ballot, and then you vote, let's just say, I'll pick a number, 10 million people, just an arbitrary number, and you vote those for Joe Biden or any other candidate. The ability to do that for a nation state like Communist China is absolutely clear. Whether we have evidence of that is still being assessed. But what the president was suggesting last night was that the intelligence community withheld these facts from him, that capability, both before and after, and kept from him things that he obviously should have known, which were acts of war by Communist China against the United States. There's some question about whether or not the electronic voting machines flipped votes. Well, that was not something that the intelligence community, if they know it, it's not yet been uncovered. But they weren't studying that, or they weren't analyzing the situation, and they weren't doing what they should have been to make sure that our systems were in fact protected. As we've talked about on this show many times, we know that the components in the machines, almost all of them, are made in Communist China or Taiwan. Many of the machines, maybe a third of the machines or more, are assembled in Communist China or Taiwan. Some are manufactured in America, but even those are using Chinese components. The ability of these machines, because they're using computer software that can be programmed, it's quite obvious that they can be programmed to, in fact, manipulate votes. Where we are today is we have a lot of belief about the vulnerability of the system. What we don't have are the actual facts about how and where that happened. And we have a lot of stories about Venezuela, for instance, or China itself, or the software being developed in Serbia and the origins of Dominion voting. What we don't have is anything authoritative that has yet been made public. And that's the key point, yet been made public. There's been a lot of independent research on this. There's been a lot of investigations. But now is the time for two things to happen, and I'll conclude with this, Frank. It's time for everything to be uncovered that we know. And I would say even then, we may not have at our disposal all of the facts. But we have an election coming up here. And the thing to realize is, just given the facts that we are acknowledging publicly that Communist China has been part of this, we have to take the necessary steps to make sure that they can't do this in this fall's election and in 2028. That means the logic of what the president said last night would mean that we have to ban the voting machines. Secretary Mullen didn't say that this morning. He said that DHS would work with states on that. Well, I will tell you right now, that's impossible. There's no way to work with states to fix those machines. They're not fixable. The software, the databases, the reporting systems that we're using today, those aren't fixable. We have to get back to a system of paper ballots, marked by humans, counted by humans, and done in the most transparent way possible, yielding the fairest election possible. We have to do that today because Communist China or any bad actor can manipulate an electronic voting system. The necessary steps to get us there are something we can talk about, Frank. I don't think it's as easy or obvious as some even on this call may believe. I think it will be a huge political fight, but it's one we're absolutely going to have in the future. And I think this is the start. Last night was a start for the president of making these facts known publicly, but I think we're going to have a political fight on our hands, the likes of which we've never seen, if in fact we're going to take the president and his beliefs last night that our system is vulnerable and needs to be fixed. The political fight to fix it is going to be a very big one, and it's going to be something that both the president and this committee are going to have to be spending a lot of time on over the next several months. So thank you, Frank, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Brian, thank you. Wonderful overview. Let me just say I failed to note that I call you Mr. President because you've been the president of the highly regarded Claremont Institute and are now the president of the American Strategy Group, as well as the chairman of our committee, and we very much appreciate your contribution. We're going to turn next to another man who has been deeply studying and bringing in extraordinary intellect as well as analytic capability to bear on the issue of election integrity for many years now. His name is Dr. Jerome Corsi. He is the author of some 25 books that include several that have had profound impact, I believe, electorally and otherwise, including Unfit for Command, and Coup d'etat, exposing deep state treason and the plan to re-elect President Trump. Jerry is very deeply involved in the ongoing effort to get to the bottom of what happened in the 2020 elections, but also to help with fashioning a way forward, specifically to assure, as the president has made clear he intends to do, and as Brian has just suggested as well, must be done, to prevent anything like a repetition of the 2020 debacle and other elections that have similarly been tainted or corrupted. Jerry, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Frank. Let me first, I've been working on this issue with Peter Titkin, who is President Trump's attorney, and for 2 years now, since the second inauguration. And the data we had brought forth really started a lot of the investigation, and that we found, and it's all on God's Five Stones, my website, G-O-D, no apostrophe in the S, 5, you spell out F-I-V, and stones is plural, godsfivestones.com. Andrew Paquette, about 2 years ago, found algorithms in the State Board of Election voter registration file in New York that permitted the creation of millions of false records and that could yet be voted. Now, it was very mathematical. A lawyer in Ohio sent me the paper, and I studied it, and there were algorithms in it. I verified that. And the key to the voter switching files and changing votes is not really the major issue. The major issue is that you can create a false vote, but you also have to be able to make it give it a legitimate state voter ID so it can be voted, which requires a cryptographic scheme to create the vote and hide it so it can be used in mail-in ballot schemes. Now, what President Trump was doing last night, and again, to understand what he did last night, it depends upon how you frame it. Last night's exercise was not about showing votes flipped. That's down the road. What President Trump is doing is he's setting the predicate for a national security emergency declaration to come out down the road. And last night, the key issue was that foreign nations have penetrated our elections and have gotten a hold of voter registration files in massive quantities with the capability of impacting our election. Now, just the evidence coming out of Venezuela and communist China with hacking is enough to say we're under foreign attack. It's from both of these vulnerabilities to foreign nations who are penetrating our election system. That alone is a national security emergency. And the data released, what Donald Trump said yesterday, that information had been suppressed by the intelligence agencies and kept from the president, is a marker that he's going after potentially, ultimately, indications of treason. He also laid it at Barack Obama's footsteps as involved personally in it, which was a direct a suggestion that should these investigations ultimately lead to treasonous activity to suppress evidence of voter interference in the election, that there could be some massive prosecutions down the road, but not immediately. Now, the powers of the president under national security emergency declaration, which have been contested in the courts and are very little understood even by top constitutional scholars, will require a 2/3 vote in the House and Senate to overturn it. President Trump has that authority. He has the authority to say our elections have been compromised and we're not going to allow it to happen again. Now, the first salvo is not the entire act. And Donald Trump last night did not declare national security emergency, but he set the predicate with foreign involvement. Next, we're going to begin seeing a lot of actions coming out of Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice filing. There's, I think, 130 cases that have been filed. Most people are unaware of the BOST v. Illinois State Board of Elections Supreme Court case decided in January this year, 6-3 majority. Chief Justice Powell wrote the case. Congressman Bost challenged before the voting that prolonged counting of absentee ballots was inherently unfair, and the Chief Justice agreed. Roberts agreed and said it was like letting the race go to 103 meters when it was a 100-meter race and declaring the winner at 103 meters. Now, last night was mainly aimed at putting pressure on the SAVE Act to get passed. And I think the chances of that happening now have increased. But this is round one of the evidence, and there will be more definitive action. The press is trying to frame this as you can't show us votes that were switched. Well, they can, and that evidence is ultimately available in multiple states and is being collected even right now in Georgia. But that didn't have to be released yesterday. The press could be set up so that you had major networks like NBC and CBS was the only major network that carried this. And President Trump suggested last night their licenses can be challenged. Those challenges are probably forthcoming. The mainstream media saying all these claims have been refuted and all the Supreme Court cases and cases brought in the courts in 2020 were not favorable to Trump. Well, they were in 2020 challenging a certified election. That's hard to do. Standing is hard to get in that issue. The Bose case showed that challenging an election before it was held, a candidate has standing. And in fact, the Supreme Court will not be able to enter into a National Security Emergency Act because the Supreme Court has no role. It turns to Congress, 2/3 majority in each house, to overturn that. So what the media is desperately afraid of is that President Trump has the authority in his office alone to have federal supervision of the election, even if it were to involve using the National Guard or inspectors or whatever he decides to do, ICE supervisors to see who shows up as foreign nationals trying to vote, and criminal prosecutions resulting. So Trump put the nation on notice last night that a national security emergency declaration is in the works, going to come down, criminal prosecutions are going to begin and are available to be investigated, even to the level of looking at treasonous actions. The press trying to say, well, we didn't show any votes were flipped, missed the point. And their attempt to reframe what happened last night, I think, fails miserably to those of us who know what's going on.
Jerry, thank you so much. Again, further fleshing out both what the president spoke to and its importance. We're going to turn next to one of our most eminent China watchers, monitors, assessors in terms of the unrestricted warfare threat that it poses to this country, to get his sense both as to the larger complexion of the enemy that we face in the Chinese Communist Party and the importance of this particular line of attack to its larger strategy of destroying our country. Our next presenter is Captain James Fanell, United States Navy retired, man who has throughout a distinguished career in the armed forces, notably in his final duty station as the Chief of Intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, been extraordinarily clear-eyed about what the Chinese communists were up to, both with respect to their military capabilities and ambitions, and what it would mean for our country if not checked. He is the co-author with Dr. Bradley Thayer of a best-selling book entitled Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure, one aspect of which is a phenomenon that they've described as threat deflation at the hands of what the Chinese have called old friends of China, enablers and other fellow travelers who are complicit in some of the damage that has been done, notably, as we will hear from Captain Fanell, with respect to the corruption of our election system by the Chinese communists and their friends. Captain Fanell, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is now yours, sir.
Thank you, Frank, and it's an honor to be with this webinar today and the other panelists. There's nothing more important and more sacred for the United States American citizen than the franchise, the vote, and the integrity of that process. And what President Trump did last night was stand up and describe, and as Brian and Mr. Corsi have said, the system was not secure, the system was at risk, and it was penetrated and influenced by the People's Republic of China. The details of the specifics of what happened and those things will be, further revealed and analyzed. But the idea that we had an adversary in the Chinese Communist Party that was dedicated to subverting our election process through whatever means that they could is unquestioned. And I spent part of this day looking at the whitehouse.gov website and the different pillars of information that they put up for what has occurred and the data that they had. And one section was called China's Acquisition and Exploitation of American Voter Data. And in that section, there was 23 classified, now declassified documents. They're redacted, but the redactions aren't really relevant to the message it comes across. And the message it comes across is kind of two-part. The first part is there's more than enough evidence provided there that demonstrates that the Chinese had intentions and that the IC at some levels, in some parts, understood that the Chinese wanted to influence our election. But there's also another part to it, which is there were other parts of the IC at higher levels in different agencies, and I'll call out two of them, Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency, that were questioned by other analysts by the NIO, National Intelligence Officer for Cyber, questioned why CIA and NSA were massaging or changing and threat deflating China's involvement in this nefarious activity. So this is not a surprise to me. It's not a surprise to anybody who's a member of the Committee on Present Danger China. But what it does is it blows a hole in 50 years of what we have had, which is in pro-engagement with the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party. And this engagement school that was created by Henry Kissinger has dominated the U.S. government, dominated our think tanks, the national security apparatus. It's dominated Wall Street and a lot of other places. But in terms of our national security apparatus and in the intelligence community where I worked for almost 30 years, this kind of thinking was dominant in all services. That's in the Department of Defense, now Department of War, but also at Langley, also at Bowling, also at Fort Meade with NSA and the other agencies. There was a propensity, almost always a reflexive response, was to continually downplay both the Chinese Communist Party's intentions towards America and the capabilities that they were developing. And these few documents, which, as the president noted, came from a burn bag that some knucklehead didn't destroy, are just the tip of an iceberg. And so what I would hope will happen is, in addition to all the election integrity measures that have been mentioned so far, and I agree with them 100%, we would also create a special outside independent review organization that's not part of CIA, it's not part of ODNI, but former officials, trusted outsiders, people with integrity that can come in and start examining other aspects of the U.S. intelligence community. If the U.S. intelligence community had the audacity to go after our elections and to actually suppress information that the Chinese were trying to influence the most sacred element of our republic, what else did the intelligence community do on other areas? Like where I live, what I study is the People's Liberation Army. What did we not understand, or what did we suppress about the PRC's nuclear aspirations? We just had the Chinese conduct a nuclear test launch of a submarine-launched ballistic missile, the second such test of a ballistic ICBM in the last 2 years after a 40-plus year gap. What else did we not understand about the desires of the PLA and the Chinese Communist Party to build a carrier force, to build a nuclear submarine force, to build a bomber force, a strategic bomber force, a fighter force, a strategic rocket force? What other areas of threat deflation did the IC inflict upon this nation and cause us not to be prepared? I used this analogy earlier today. It's like if you have a Bunsen burner and a flame and your hand is on the flame. If your hand is on that flame, you will immediately pull your hand away because you can feel the pain. But what the IC did and was part of complicit in is they lowered that Bunsen burner down here so that your hand was here, but you didn't really feel the flame. The IC is very sophisticated, very nuanced, and they would never say there was no flame. But what they would tell you is, oh, the flame's 20 to 30 years away, so you don't have to worry about it. And that kind of thinking infiltrated our assessments, our DOD acquisition, DO war acquisition process, weapons development. It went into Congress, so Congress never felt compelled to watch as the U.S. Navy was cut in half from 600 ships in 1986 to 300 today, while China concurrently went from being a brown water Navy to the largest Navy on the planet. How could that happen unless the IC was complicit in suppressing the real threat and taking that flame away from the ass of Congress and different administrations. And that's what's occurred. And the fact that President Trump stood up and highlighted this and called it out should be a call for an outside independent investigation into what the IC's been doing. Who were the people? Who were the national intelligence officers for China over the last 30 years? What assessments did they sign off on? Why did they sign off on them? And what was the empirical evidence that may have run counter to what they finally word changed and word salad out so that it didn't look like China was an imminent threat? That's what I am happy to see from the president's speech. There's a hell of a lot more to do. And I'm not an expert in elections, but I can tell you this gets to the heart of our republic and it has to be addressed. And we have to get after the IC and this idea that they're infallible and that they're just good servants when we have ample evidence to say that they were threat deflating the threat from the Communist Party of China, who has dedicated themselves to destroying the United States of America, ideologically and maybe even physically.
Thank you, Captain. Very important insights into a systemic problem within the U.S. government that transcends, of course, the election integrity piece. And we'll be coming back to that with you in a Q&A here in a moment. We're going to hear next from a man who has been tirelessly working at the state level, in particular in his native state of Nevada, but with secretaries of state and other election officials across the country on election integrity matters, at least since the aftermath of the 2020 election. Possibly we'll find out more about it in the preceding years as well. Matt Meck is his name. He is a retired naval aviator with distinguished service in the United States Marine Corps. He is a board member of the Fight Voter Fraud, I think it is, and a co-founder of the Fraud Fighter Summit. We've turned to him in the past for his insights into such matters, and we're delighted to be able to do so in the aftermath of the president's statement yesterday. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Frank, thank you. And just it's an honor to be with this august group of individuals. And I'm glad to see we got another jarhead here as well. We're trying to do our best. And Frank, I got to say, watching the speech last night, really, I can tell you this: the coalition that we talk about, which is secretaries of state, former secretaries of state. It goes from Hawaii to Massachusetts, Alaska to Texas. Folks who've been in this pitched battle for election integrity since, well, we actually started with it was the inaugural Secretaries of State Summit at the Trump Hotel here in Vegas on 1 May of 2021. And for everyone we just talked about, Dr. Corsi spot on as always. Brian was, and I think this is the beginning of this opening kick, if you will, of the football game. President Trump has laid down the markers, and if I could, listening to folks talk about the election system trying to audit itself, or the IC trying to audit itself, I would ask folks to go research Kurt Gödel, G-O-umlaut-D-E-L, a famous logician, who said a system cannot audit itself. A system cannot prove itself. And we see that in the IC. We see that in the election domain. And, we talk, Wayne Allen Root, of course, lives here in my town as well. We'll have him at our Storm Summit, which is going to be 10 through 13 September at the Ahern Hotel. And, Frank, an event you were at with us January of last year at a home in Great Falls, Virginia, we had some folks in and around the president talk to us after the inauguration to take these collective minds, constitutional attorneys, election officials, secretaries of state, and average everyday people, and kind of put together a proposed draft EO that we had submitted up the chain. I think it was April of 2025, and it's that 17-page document you hear Wayne Allen Root talk about and so forth, which was what we thought a system should look like. And everybody I know who are technicians and technologists and IT people echo what a lot of this panel said, and I think we all agree with, is you cannot have machines being involved in our elections. Laura Logan, the great Laura Logan, who's a dear friend, said it at several of our events that she moderated, Frank, was she asked people, anybody out here in the audience speak machine language? No one raised their hand. And her typical Sicilian Irish passion, she said, then how the hell do you know what's going on inside the machines? You don't. And Frank, I'm heartened what's going on. And I agree with what Dr. Corsi said and went on route. I don't think there's another alternative but for the president to declare a national emergency and cite people to go look at the Youngstown Steel case and so forth. When the president is in alignment with things Congress already approved, like the National Emergencies Act, in the words of the Supreme Court, when the Constitution is not explicitly clear on things, he is at the zenith of his power when he is in alignment with the Congress. So, Frank, back to you, but we are ready to roll up our sleeves and to help the president and help the nation get our elections back on track. And the last thing I'll say, it's interesting, at the Fraud Fighter Summit, there was a woman who was from Compton, California. I was on the phone with her. Somebody had asked me to talk with her. She believed in her heart that Trump and the Republicans stole 2024 for President Trump at the presidential level. And instead of, making an R versus D thing, I said, you have concerns that the system is not transparent, it's not understandable, and it's not verifiable nor auditable. She goes, yes, exactly. I said, would you agree that the other side has same concerns? She goes, yes. Would you work with me then to create a better system so no one has that issue? And that was the great start of a dialogue, which I think President Trump has helped to set the ground for last night.
That's an extraordinarily helpful, account. And again, a tribute to what you and these acting and former officials are doing to try to bring, both forensic analysis and constructive problem solving to bear, Matt. And we're so appreciative of what you're doing and your participation in this program to talk about it. We're going to hear from that other jarhead, as you call him. We also think of him as a very distinguished member of this Committee on the Present Danger, China, and distinguished United States Marine veteran, Colonel Grant Newsham. Grant has the further distinction of having also served as a Foreign Service officer in our embassy in Tokyo. He's been in business in the Western Pacific for quite some time and has, as a result of specifically his forward deployed location, mostly in Japan, eyes on the Chinese Communist Party and as good an idea of what it is doing in various ways to put at risk our country. He wrote about all of it in his best-selling book entitled When China Attacks, A Warning to America. Colonel Newsham, we are delighted to have you with us. You, as everyone else, fell in to participate in this program with basically zero notice because of the lateness of the president's address and are wanting to make sure we understood what he was going to be talking about. But thank you for participating and for taking the baton at this point, sir. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Frank. Glad to be here. As for the jarhead thing, I think it's more we're the aristocrats who are the men's department of the U.S. Navy. But that's it. Okay. But what I'm going to talk about is this idea of the Chinese involvement in our electoral system. And I think to everyone who follows this issue, it's really not a surprise at all. And nothing that they heard last night from the president was all that surprising. It was very interesting, of course, and a good thing. But when you think about our elections and say just take the 2020 election, it requires you to believe something that just doesn't make sense. And here's what I'm getting at. Now, let's look at just the question of Chinese cyber capabilities. We know that China has various programs like the Salt Typhoon that the U.S. government talks about, it admits to, where they have gotten into all of our critical infrastructure, all of it. And they've been in there a long time sitting there. And this is the most sensitive stuff we have. And you can actually get a sense of despair almost and terror when this is announced by the U.S. government. Additionally, we know the Chinese stole all 23 personnel files in the Office of Management and Budget of everyone who ever applied for a security clearance. They've got it all, and they took it during the Obama administration. And so you would think that that would be very well protected. There's one company, a Chinese telecom company, that for some period of time, on more than one occasion, has basically hijacked the internet, and this is not hard to find. It's all been reported. Their cyber capabilities that stole the plans for the F-35, the C-17 transport, against our military targets, against commercial targets. This is all very well known. And the problems with Chinese software in things like drones, electric vehicles, the cranes in our ports, even city buses. This is widely known, widely talked about, and considered a huge threat. And yet we're supposed to think that when it comes to our electoral system, that the Chinese somehow haven't noticed it or are too stupid to figure out how to break into the system electronically. It doesn't make any sense at all. This is, in fact, we're told, you're always told, change your passwords for your ATM, for your computers. But the US electoral system, well, not a chance the Chinese could possibly get into it. The hardware and the software that makes up the system, the counting, the tabulators, etc. I don't think the Chinese would even have to break a sweat if you look at the success they have had on other extremely difficult targets. And you'll note, of course, after the 2020 election, the head of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, if you can find his name on the internet, he said this was the safest election ever held in American history. He made that announcement about 2 weeks after the election. That is not nearly enough time to be able to assess what happened in the national election of the complexity and scale of the United States. And then also keep in mind that about 2 weeks after he made that announcement, the US government was hit by, I think, the biggest cyber attack it had ever been hit with, and courtesy of China. So the guy who assured us that everything was okay with the election, 2 weeks later, the US systems that he's responsible for just get hammered by the Chinese. So one would reasonably think, well, there's something to worry about here, and there's some research that needs to be done. But all you hear is that CISA, this guy said, safest election ever. Everything, any claims of wrongdoing or problems in the election, well, that's conspiracy theory. It's just this blanket denial instead of looking into it. Now, you might think, of course, well, the CIA and the intelligence community, they're all over this. So if there was something, they would have found it. Well, I'm not so sure about that. I will bet that they have not put any of the resources, or hardly any, that they need to look into election integrity. It is not a hot topic for them. Additionally, in recent decades, the intelligence community seems to have been sort of equal measures incompetent and political. I would cite the COVID pandemic, where the intelligence community wouldn't even say where it came from, even though any taxi driver and any, well, if he could speak English, in an American city could have told you where it came from. And they also appear to have gone out of their way not to implicate China. And in all of the things that we've been talking about, particularly the president's speech, it appears that they have withheld intelligence from him and from Congress, massaged it, manipulated it, and in a way that none of us, that people wouldn't imagine. And I would also cite that letter on Hunter Biden's laptop signed by 51 prominent former, well, many of them prominent, former intelligence officers who said this is Russian disinformation. It's bogus. And they knew what it was, but they did it because, in the words of Mike Morrell, the acting director, former acting director of the CIA, who was behind the letter, he said when he was hauled before Congress, well, I wanted Trump to lose. And that's the kind of people we are dealing with. So when you think about the problems in our electoral system, don't count on the intelligence community to actually get to the bottom of this. This tape is going to somehow get figured out in some other way. Now, we might also think when it comes to our intelligence or electoral system, well, the Department of Justice and FBI, they have flying squads of agents and auditors to go investigate claims of electoral fraud, electoral irregularities. Well, they don't have anything of the sort. They just don't have it. It is grossly undermanned, and it really doesn't do anything. At the state level, it's no better. And the chances of getting in and detecting fraud and wrongdoing in an election in the amount of time that they have available are pretty close to zero. So we really have no way of auditing the sanctity of a U.S. election. It's also worth looking into or considering this in the terms of the broader Chinese approach to warfare and really trying to destroy us. And going after the electoral system is just one part of a broader strategy they refer to as unrestricted warfare, war without rules, you name it. But that's where the elections fit in. And this is things like chemical warfare, drug warfare, the fentanyl that's killed 800,000 of us and rising, going after the press. Not that that's very hard for them to do. It's easy to find reporters who will say something bad about President Trump. The Chinese don't have to work very hard there. They subverted the business community, and they have got proxies throughout our political class as well. And the rioting, if you remember, that was taking place in 2020 in our cities, BLM and Antifa, well, the ties to the Chinese Communist Party go back quite a ways with both of those. So this is just part of a broader scheme to bring down the United States. And so what I want to go back to is, one, that President Trump said what was pretty well known. And now the question is, what do we do with it? And also, let's really go over the documents and see what was released. But it is going to take some sort of a real review of our system, because it has simply got so many problems. And the Chinese role in it, it would take really an ideologue or somebody on the Chinese payroll to actually dismiss it as baseless conspiracy theories and racist thinking. So just a few comments on the subject. Thank you for having me, Frank.
Terrific, Brent. And again, a macro picture here that's very, very helpful indeed. We've got some time for some give and take with this distinguished panel and between its members, I hope, as well. I wanted to start by coming back to this sort of issues of systemic problems. We know the systemic whole of society people's war that the Chinese have been waging against us. It's not just the unrestricted warfare, it's a total war. We've been told, going back, I believe, to 2019, when this was announced in the pages of the People's Daily. Could each of you take a moment and just speak to this issue of how a nation like ours can contend with a nation like China's with the vast resources that they're able to bring to bear, human as well as technological, if in fact we're doing other than the most basic means of casting and then tabulating ballots, i.e. paper ballots, with appropriate identifications along the lines of the SAVE Act, and in local precincts with a very limited amount of time, given to the processing of the votes. Brian, maybe we could start with you. You've studied this closely and been warning of the need for this for quite some time.
Well, thank you, Frank. I mostly on this, I just operate on common sense. When we start with the notion that you can't trust machines, because even if they were made entirely in the United States, they're not. As I said, they have components made in communist China using software, much of which was not designed in the United States. Let's start there. Once you have that as one alternative, and even if they weren't made in communist China or abroad anywhere else, they're computers, and computers can be hacked. Once that's one alternative, the other alternative is just the common sense way we used to do it, which is paper ballots, the way you just said, cast by humans, IDs, etc., and do it in the most transparent way possible. If you look at the current system of electronic voting and mail-in balloting, you'd almost come up with the conclusion that it was designed solely in order for there to be fraud, to facilitate fraud, to facilitate the theft of the elections. I'd recommend to all the viewers tonight an HBO documentary called Kill Chain, the cyber war on America's elections from 2020 that laid out the vulnerability of the system. It was done by a left-wing Finnish documentarian. The stars of the documentary were Democrat Senators Elizabeth Warren, Ron Wyden, and Amy Klobuchar. They were making the case back in 2020 that the Russians were going to steal the election for Trump using the electronic voting system. It was widely understood on the left that you couldn't trust these systems. On the right, it was believed you couldn't trust these voting systems. Only when there was a presidential election stolen in 2020 did our side really wake up to the notion that this system could no longer continue. I would say, Frank, that with all due respect to Jerry Corsi and Matt Meck, both of whom I admire deeply, I think the notion of using the National Emergencies Act is not going to be quite as simple as they think. I think there's going to be an enormous political fight. I've read Peter Ticknon's memo. I've read other constitutional scholars. I've read everything that the left has put out about the National Emergencies Act. And it may work. I hope it works, but I fear it won't work. And I do believe that the court will take it up, and the court could easily rule against President Trump. I don't care what the National Emergency Act says. This is a court that is not to be relied on. Now, what does that mean? I think it means that there's going to be extraordinary political back and forth between the president and the Congress. He'll need the Congress anyway to even using the logic that Jerry laid out. You're still going to need 2/3 of Congress on your, a third plus one on your side to sustain any kind of override. But even then, I think we're in for the biggest political fight of our life if President Trump actually takes that next step and outlaws the voting machines and requires paper ballots, because there's no real enforcement method to make that a reality. The state of California is going to tell them to go pound sand. And then your only option is a political option. Let's just say the president said, no voting machines, they're going to say, so what? We're going to use voting machines. What are you going to do about it? The only alternative that the president has is to seize the voting machines, which is not an easy thing to do. Big country of ours. Seizing the voting machines is going to be a difficult proposition. The other thing would be to have Speaker Johnson and, President Pro Tem Thune not seat those people who are elected in those states that used electronic voting machines. That's a big political step too. Maybe a third of the country would not be represented in Congress under those circumstances. And I say all this just to color what may transpire over the next coming weeks and months about making this into a reality. The political fight is a very big one. And I hope they're right about the ease, but I in my own research, don't think it's quite that easy. And I think the logic of our Constitution is not going to make it that easy. And there are very specific statutes that accompany the National Emergency Act that the president would have to use creatively, I think, in order to make that a reality. Anyway, I say that just because I don't want anybody listening to the show to think this is there's just a simple cut and dry solution that's going to work here.
Brian, thank you. You went a little further afield than I had in mind, but very helpfully. Let me turn to you, Jerry, to talk a little bit more about the way forward as you see it. Informed by this issue of, if we are going to continue to be beset by Chinese and other enemies seeking to use elections to take us down, how can we protect ourselves other than whether it's a SAVE Act or whether it's a national executive order of a national security emergency to right the ship?
Well, the SAVE Act won't do it by itself. And SAVE Act will possibly get passed now in some form or other and be a useful tool. But clearly the fact of foreign interference, China's interference, is determined to be an act of war. That's almost hard to dispute. And also, it's important to understand, when you try to evaluate these, you've got to understand what game is being played. So first of all, President Trump is not yet at the point of issuing a national security emergency declaration. And we can debate the constitutionality of that, but the court, I think, would be reluctant to enter into it when it comes to a political issue such as voting. If it is a national security issue, and that's demonstrated by the president, it has been last night in salvo number 1, that's going to impact the voting constituency, and the vast majority of the American people believe our system is broken. Now, what's happening is that the president is in the process of exposing both the bias of the mainstream media, the inadequacy of the intelligence community, the criminality that was involved in burn bags and evidence being destroyed, the fact that there was a plot and desire to suppress evidence from the President of the United States, which borders on treason. These are some very serious charges, and this is just round 1. The Department of Homeland Security is prepared with evidence. There are federal observers already going into the primaries in the 4 or 5 states. There are states that have not turned over their voter rolls yet for inspection. And when you go back to the various kinds of orders that the presidents have had to call, going back to President Eisenhower and President Kennedy sending federal troops to desegregate schools, the powers of the president in these kinds of situations are very, very strong. Now, the Constitution does not allow, a national security emergency. They don't want the president to become a dictator in times of crisis, as the Roman system allowed. But the powers of the National Emergency Act, especially under Reagan, when cases like INS v. Shada, etc., began to establish you needed both houses of Congress, 2/3 majority to overturn a national security emergency order. I think if President Trump was well aware of the constitutionality and the political fight, one of the things Donald Trump is doing is he's exposing the left now, which has gone, the Democratic Party, Democratic Socialist of America, running candidates that want to eliminate the presidency, pack the court, any number of other, open the borders, defund the police. The American people are beginning to be shown the complete vacuity and maybe the revolutionary nature of what the Democratic Party and the American left has been. Marco Rubio's speech yesterday was extremely powerful in terms of the violence of the radical left. And there's a case here being built systematically for the American people. And when it comes down to the next few months rolling out, we're in July, and we have quite a bit of time before we go to the vote in November. This case, I think, is going to be built systematically by the White House, which has been in preparation for doing this for 2 years. This is not a recent plan. So I think a lot more thought and planning has been given, but I know Donald Trump pretty well. And the president who will take the first action militarily against Iran is a president who's not going to allow a midterm election to be stolen, even if it does require using a national security emergency and throwing the country into that kind of a constitutional crisis. Donald Trump is not about to let the election be stolen.
Jerry, thank you. Captain Fanell, again, you're probably our foremost expert on the indefatigable character of the Chinese assault. Your thoughts on how we protect our country against this, against the backdrop of what we've just been told could be tremendous political upheaval inside the United States.
I'd like what Dr. Corsi said, and I'd like to use an analogy to that. There's a lot we have been discussing in the committee and elsewhere about this economic involvement and engagement with China. And there's this, decoupling discussion. We can't, people say we can't completely decouple. So we'll, try to fence off certain areas and things of that nature. And so we recognize that we can't go from 100% engagement to 0% engagement. It's just too difficult. And I think it's the same way in this election integrity business. The president as Mr. Corsi said, he's not going to take on dictatorial actions that would feed, the agenda of the left to accuse the president of being a dictator. But what he can do is he can raise this issue. He can put markers down that put people on notice that they may be criminally held liable, even for up to treason. And there's other things that he can do that will mitigate the likelihood or the risk of the cheating. Will it get it 100% off? Maybe not. But there's things that he can do. For instance, he doesn't have to have a National Security Act to order U.S. Cyber Command to take action to directly look at voting machines to prevent them from being infiltrated or attacked by Chinese or other outside actors. Now, I don't know all the details of that, but U.S. Cyber Command is a combatant commander underneath the Department of War and works for the commander-in-chief. That's the president. So he can take some actions, and every little thing that he does mitigates the risk, and it it's the old statement, right? As soon as you turn the light on in an apartment that's been left with food on the floor, the cockroaches do what? They go scrambling for the corners. So part of what President Trump is doing is he's turning the light on, and the cockroaches are going to, instead of trying to keep eating the food, they got to run for the corners and the holes so that they don't get smashed. And so that's what I think is happening. The question is, will that be sufficient enough to prevent the election from being stolen? And I can't answer that. I understand the desire to have a national act or something that takes over, federalizes our elections, but there's unintended consequences there. So I think we have to do everything that is legal under the president's authority. So Cyber Command, even though it may be filled with people that are deep staters and don't like the president, he still can give orders, and he can still fire people that don't follow through on those orders. And I think that we've had a year and a half of a new sec war and people that are in place in these agencies that we can start, demanding that, hey, start looking after this. So that's kind of the way I look at it. We have to take actions. We have to mitigate, and to use a baseball analogy, the pitcher has to throw a brushback pitch right now. We need to get some space to get integrity and fairness in the election. And that's the way I see it right now. But we don't want to feed the left and the Marxist communist agenda, which says, hey, we're just a bunch of fascists and we want to take over elections and control people. That's not what we're seeking to do. That's not what the president's seeking to do. We're seeking to bring one vote, one person, and so and make it secure. And the Chinese, they're going to continue to do this. So there has to be brushback pitches to Xi. So one of the things that needs to happen is Trump, in my opinion, should cancel Xi's visit, and he should apply tariffs right now. There should be tariffs for what he said yesterday. He should say, based on the evidence that I have now, I'm instituting a 100%, a 200%, whatever it is, some major significant tariff on the People's Republic of China for what's happened. And then to say, oh, by the way, we're going to make sure that any oil that comes out of the Gulf, not just out of Iran, but we may want to interdict any oil that comes to you because of what you've done to us. Those are the kinds of actions that need to be considered as well.
They would certainly get the Chinese attention. That's a bankable proposition. Let me ask you, if I can, Matt, Jerry has suggested that there's ample time to take the sorts of steps that are needed here to both make the case more fulsomely, lay out the evidence even more compellingly, presumably, and also establish whether the choice is going to be an executive order or a SAVE Act or some other measure. You're deeply involved in the election integrity fulminations of those who are actually, in some cases, even now, working these problems of trying to make sure that their states' voter rolls are clean and so on. Do we, in fact, have time for this election, or is it going to be upon us before any of this can be really addressed materially, do you think?
I would say, optimally, the way I would like to see it done, it would be working more with more, alacrity and the people could see what was happening from last year. I think Dr. Corsi is saying the right things, though, is that there's a lot happening behind the scenes. And we've talked to folks who, been briefing Tulsi and DOJ and the White House and so forth. And there's a lot going on behind the scenes. Part of it, we were hearing on the outside the tension in the IC just for what Trump did yesterday. But I think there's time. And I think what I agree with Dr. Corsi on is that I don't see any other option to fix this right now. The system needs a systemic shock because it is so metastasized with corruption. I don't see it any other way. Matter of fact, after that meeting you were with us with, Frank, in January of last year, we engaged with some of the folks who were former national heads of the labs here in the country, and had them do an analysis. The machines you've got out there, whether it's Dominion, Hart InterCivic, ESNS, Smartmatic, whatever, is there a way to fix those in the time between the midterms? And this was started last year. Between then and the midterms, can you fix them, or can you replace them with a system that would hit all the check marks for what the Department of War requires for us to do for any critical infrastructure in DHS? And they said, no, absolutely not. You can't do it. So I think Trump loves optionality, and he's looking at all the options, and further something that it might not be what you would want to have to do, but I think he's being going through all the calculations. I think he's going down a path that this is the only way to actually fix it, regardless of the politics. It's what's right for the country. I love what he said before. Not last night, but before, when he makes decisions, it's not what's the best for my polling, my politics all the time. It's what's best for the country. And if I could, two things. You remember, Frank, you and I and Brian were on a Every Legal Vote call back, November 2020. And our great colleague, Colonel John Mills, retired U.S. Army, was at NSA. And in January of 2009, he said, remember, Obama came into office and had them stop looking at Venezuela. Just stop. And initially, John thought during the time that, well, new administration, new priorities. In 2020, he looked back with 2020 clarity. And that was an interesting tell that the NSA was directed to stop looking at Venezuela in 2009. And finally, I'll leave it with this. I urge folks to go look at, in my opinion, the only full forensic audit of an investigation of an election worth the heck is the Cuyahoga County 2006 one. And in that, if you took out all bad intentions and just using the machines, I think it was Diebold at the time, that report showed just using the machines, Frank, the machines injected a 10% error rate. And now in your lifetime, how many elections have been won by 10 points or less? The reason I asked that question, if the margin of error is greater than the margin of victory, discount everything else. Just that alone, no election is certifiable nor verifiable in the system we have right now.
Colonel Newsham, finally to you, in addition to inviting you to comment on what's been just said on these various aspects of the underlying struggle with the Chinese Communist Party. And mindful, again, as we've been talking about, it's not just the Chinese. It's fellow travelers, it's friends, it's democratic socialists, it's, I would add into the mix, Sharia supremacists as well, who are interested in using elections to achieve their desired end state, which is the takedown of our country. But just staying with the Chinese, because this is, after all, the Committee on the Present Danger China programming. When you look at what China is doing right now, and you study it, as I said, very closely, day in and day out, this is against the backdrop, this particular critical moment in which the President of the United States has essentially made clear the Chinese Communist Party have used unrestricted warfare techniques through our elections to bring down the government of the United States. With everything else that the Chinese are up to in the Western Pacific, nuclear capabilities that Captain Fanell has talked about, we've done programming on as well, the continued ratcheting up of pressure on Taiwan, the Philippines, Japan, Guam, for that matter. In short, the seeming intensification of the threat in that part of the world, the old-fashioned kinetic kind of threat, plus something we haven't touched on here, but it's also of abiding concern, I think, to all of us, and that is the possibility that there may be the presence in our country of large numbers of Chinese soldiers who were brought in during the open border period of Joe Biden. Brian Kennedy on these programs and elsewhere has indicated that there may be as many as 200,000 of them. Whatever the number is, it's obviously a very considerable threat if weaponized. How do you see, sir, the state of this war, and how does that factor into the decisions that the president must take now to respond to what has been described here as an act of war against us by China?
In baseball terms, I'd say it's the bottom of the seventh, and we're down by about 4. Sort of playing the old Yankees when they were good, are really good. It's late in the day, and the Chinese have been hitting us on all fronts, not just kinetic, the military, but you can see it in their proxy warfare, where they bought off a good chunk of Capitol Hill, where they have the donor class, Wall Street, the financial class, who see things China's way. So they're having a lot of success, and as you said, they've taken advantage of every opportunity, the open borders, etc. And our electoral system is one that we've got as a prime target. And if you think about it, when confidence in an election disappears, the country starts to tear itself apart. And that's what the Chinese refer to as or some other people refer to as entropic warfare. You're tearing it apart, you're degrading it. And that is all to China's advantage, because it makes it that much harder for us to present really a coherent opposition to them. We might push back in some ways, in some areas, but overall, we've got so many problems on our own side that it's a lot more hard. It's harder than it should be, and that is one of the benefits of China subverting our elections, and others as well who understand the fundamental importance of that to the U.S. So this is something, if you don't get a handle on it, it's going to be a huge problem for us, and the Chinese like what they see. I would note that in all of the administrations that I've been aware of, really since Nixon's, that the only one that has actually scared the Chinese was Trump, for Trump's first administration. He had some excellent people in that, and they had a plan, and they were carrying it out. Remember, they closed the Houston consulate. It wasn't just spying, but it was the subversion that was going on. They went after Chinese who were intimidating Chinese people in the United States. They just did all sorts of things that were logical, coherent, and the Chinese hated it, and they wanted them off the battlefield, and that was all the motive they need to do everything they could to get Trump out of office. Now Mr. Trump is back, and we'll see what he can do. And others have mentioned, of course, pushing back on the Chinese with this. It would be good, of course, as Captain Fanell suggested, to sort of turn loose our cyber experts on the systems, on the networks. And also it would be good for somebody to actually take a look at these machines and issue a public report on the vulnerabilities there. The only people I know who have done that are the South Koreans, where their National Intelligence Service did it in 2023, and they found that their systems were widely open to North Korean and potentially Chinese hacking, almost wide open. But nobody has done this on the U.S. side, and that should be done. But in terms of raising the cost for the Chinese, you delist and deregister every Chinese company in the United States. You kick the top 10 leading Chinese financial institutions out of the U.S. dollar system, and you raise sanctions and make it very difficult for them. And if they ask, what's the problem? Well, you tell them, well, you know why. And if we don't fight back on this, then China will keep eating away at it. And the United States is going to have that loss of confidence on the part of regular citizens in the system of how we choose our leaders, which is fundamental. But as once again, back to the baseball terms, I wish we were the ones that are up by 3 instead of being down by 3.
Thank you to each of you. Just a couple of concluding comments from me that hopefully will synthesize a bit of all of this. The president made a couple of points that I thought were particularly salient. Something to the effect that what we're talking about here is a sort of third world election system. And he actually said not even the third world does it that much. I think he said something like 130 countries have essentially officially declared that the use of these machines is impermissible. They're doing it the old-fashioned way, hand counting ballots and so on. That certainly seems to me to be something that has to be adopted, and that any amount of, cyber explorations and so on is going to come to the same point, I think, and that is, if the machines are computers, they are going to be manipulatable, especially through internet access. We also talked at length about another piece of this that I think is particularly troubling, and that is the engagement of the intelligence community in not only keeping information from the chain of command that it was not only entitled to know, but had a really important need to know, but also assembling about it, misleading about it when they were sharing information. That's a level of corruption that seems to me does give rise again to what I said earlier about a systemic problem that has to be rectified. We've talked about the domestic political turmoil. I think it's hard to overstate the dangers of that, especially at this moment. Could we see violence in the streets of the United States this summer? I'm kind of surprised we haven't seen more of it to date, to be honest with you. But efforts that are made, even when it's as clear as I think it can be here, that the purpose is to assure free and fair elections that are properly managed and not subject to wholesale cheating, like mail-in ballots, like these machines, like having voter rolls corrupted and shared with our enemies, and so on. We have our work cut out for us, I guess, is the bottom line. But as a committee on the present danger of China, I think of special concern is all of this is against the backdrop of an enemy that is ever more aggressive in its threats to us and to our allies. And I think, as has been said by each of you to varying degrees, we are going to have to make what has been done to us by the Chinese costly to them, or else we will certainly see more of it, and probably a lot worse besides. What exactly that is going to entail and how it will be done will be very much the subject of our future deliberations in these programs and our conversations with all of you. We so appreciate you participating in this one and the opportunity to take stock of what the president has said and the work that is now ahead of us. I want to thank each and every one of these extraordinary national security practitioners, people who have been really at the vanguard of both the problem that we face with the Chinese Communist Party, but also to varying degrees the election integrity dimension of China's unrestricted election warfare against us. So, and thanks again to Brian Kennedy, Jerry Corsi, Captain Fanell, Matt Meck, and Colonel Grant Newsham. You are all national treasures, and we're so grateful for your time and your expertise, and look forward to collaborating with you in the future as part of this Committee on the Present Danger of China and its enterprise. God bless all of you, and God bless our country. We'll be back.